Thank you, everyone. I am the unlisted, unnamed moderator discussant in the program. My name is Hyung Lynn. I'm at the University of British Columbia, and I'm also the editor of the journal Pacific Affairs, which also has a booth, but I'm not sure what the number is. It's an academic journal that's been around since 1978. So welcome to panel 126, which is called Prospects and Challenges for Korean Reunification. What I'll do is introduce each speaker. We have 3 speakers. They'll speak for 15 to 20 minutes, I believe.
516.
516?
You got
Is your
Oh, is it? It's not 126?
no, but you're
Oh, my booth, yes, 516. Thank you, Mark. Yes. We should never, of course, lose an opportunity to propagate propaganda. Okay, so there'll be 3 speakers. They'll speak in sequence. I'll introduce each one before they speak, and then after that, I will add some comments and post some questions for them, and then we'll open up to the floor for questions and discussion. So our first speaker today is John Park, and he is currently associated with the project on managing the atom at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center and Stanton Junior Faculty Fellow at MIT. He has advised many government agencies and Track 1 or 1.2 or 1.5 diplomacy initiatives. And he's published many articles in venues such as NBR Analysis, and also book chapters as well in volumes such as The Long Shadow, Nuclear Weapons and Policy, Security in 21st Century Asia, which came out of Stanford University Press in 2008. Dr. Park received his MPhil and PhD from Cambridge University, and he completed his pre-doctoral and postdoctoral training at the Harvard Kennedy School. So without further ado, Dr. Park.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My thanks to KDI for sponsoring this panel. What I wanted to do today is present some of these key findings from the Track 1.5 dialogues that I had a chance to directly participate in when I was in Washington before. And on the basis of those dialogues, I've been trying to do more research and writing during my time in Cambridge. The topic that I'll be addressing specifically is competing regional interests and reunification. And the 3 key lenses that I wanted to use as something of a framework of analysis. The first is how key parties initially respond to reunification will disproportionately affect the type of reactions from the other countries. The second area that I wanted to look at is determining internal legitimacy in reunification, specifically the defector factor. And then third, building trust by verifying dismantlement of North Korea's arsenal. So to take a step back, if you look at a lot of writings related to reunification, either coming out from governments or think tanks or universities in a host of countries, it's usually a survey of what the various interest groups are looking at in terms of priorities of national interest. And those shift over time. So while it's important to get that kind of snapshot, there are very few writings out there that look at it from the lens of an analytical framework and try to apply and update that analytical framework. So this is a first modest attempt at that kind of approach. A number of sort of caveats. The first is in writing this, and this is still in draft form, so I very much welcome the feedback in the Q&A session. I was drawn to the warning at the bottom of all these investment brochures. And the warning goes along the lines of past performance is not necessarily indicative of future results. So when you're investing in the stock market, don't look for the superstars of yesteryear. It's hard to replicate. Very rarely do you get that kind of success. In the majority of case studies and analyses on reunification in the Korean context, the predominant past performance here is the German case. And certainly there are parts of the German experience that are applicable to potential scenarios for reunification on the Korean Peninsula. But this over-reliance on the past performance and the view that all the lessons learned are in the German case is a matter of distilling those lessons and applying them and modifying them to the Korean case, I think creates some aspects of a distortion. Again, not to say that everything that we learned from the German case is not applicable, but that we have to be, I think, much more objective than subjective. The second is to very specifically acknowledge the sources for what I'm about to present. Those are the Track 2 and Track 1.5 dialogues. There's a constellation of these dialogues, and the ones that I want to focus on are the Track 1.5 dialogues. Participants in these dialogues tend to be current and former policymakers, policy advisors. The key common variable for all of them, they come from very different backgrounds, is at one point in time, recently they served in government, usually in a policymaking or very senior policy advising capacity. So trying to get that operational insight. It's not about the rational actor model, but really looking at the unique discrepancies that they dealt with and how they moved from point A to point B and not in a linear fashion. And the third part, I wanted to lay out the core assumption for my points here. And it is the view that if we do look at reunification, it is assumed that North Korea has collapsed. I won't go into the reasons why North Korea collapsed because that's another paper altogether. But based on North Korea collapsing and South Korea is now triggering its plan to extend its sovereignty over the former North Korea, that being the working assumption. So to start off with the first part, there are really two models. And the Track 1.5 dialogues really emphasize first a South Korean consistency. And I won't go into too much on the South Korean part because Professor Yu will look in much more detail. But the tendency to view the reunification issue, opportunities and challenges through the lens of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And so when it comes to immediate response to stabilization, different aspects of implementing South Korea's plan, the U.S.-South Korean alliance is pivotal. And within this, there is initial reaction when you look at these Track 1.5 dialogues from other countries in terms of a zero-sum game mandate, the sense that if South Korea does in fact go through with the U.S.-ROC alliance as the main means of response, this immediate sense of wanting to avoid losing the initiative and yielding ground to this type of security alignment. And so there you see the regional powers seeking to either preserve their definition of the status quo or to somehow bolster their national interests in this type of situation. Looking at the second model in a little more depth, the Chinese response. There has been great consistency from Chinese government think tank analysts talking about the necessity to work through the UN Security Council to get some kind of resolution in terms of general principles, something of rules of the road as a situation like reunification were to unfold. And within that, the principle of promoting peace and stability in the region during this transitional period being the pivotal principle, but of course without the explicit definition of what that exactly means. With this, there is this consistent Chinese effort to have legitimacy recognized. If they were to respond in any way, this type of resolution through the Security Council would be a way for the Chinese to respond to any particular contingency, any type of situation under reunification, through this idea that they'll be invoking the resolution as they do any type of response. Here, it's not to say that going through the UN Security Council mechanism will avoid all competition, you'll have harmony in terms of the response, but rather the view that if you ignore the resolution, if it were to be passed, it would trigger heightened competition. That's another variable to look at very, very carefully. Moving to the second part, determining internal legitimacy and reunification, the defector factor. How reunification evolves internally will influence the ways in which competing external interests will play out as well. And here, the traditional South Korean plan in practice calls for extending South Korean sovereignty over the former DPRK. And in determining Korean legitimacy here, this defector factor has not really been incorporated. There's a view that they don't really matter, that in some circles they're the bottom of the pyramid in terms of North Korea. When it comes to the events that, the motions that would be set in play after reunification, this will be a group that somehow will just naturally assimilate with the population of the North. But I think when you look very carefully at this group, there are now 24,000 North Korean defectors in South Korea. And a minority of that group have been very active in trying to mobilize, trying to protect, trying to advance defector interests. And in doing that, they've developed the skill set of political mobilization, planning, of outreach, a number of skill sets that can be applied to extending their particular interests in a reunification scenario. So with this, to just go back very briefly to the South Korean plan, one of the core pillars is to, I wouldn't say perpetuate the division, but at least keep two separate groups. And the idea is to leverage the cheap labor pools in the North that a reunification scenario would present. And so with this, the idea is to gradually raise living standards in the north and try to help assimilate in a gradual manner the two previous Koreas into a unified country. But with this, you can see how while in practice this is something that looks very practical, in principle, implementation of this type of plan, I think, would rub up against the principles of equality and economic freedom. You will be more or less controlling the movements of the former residents, the former North Koreans in the northern part of the Korean Peninsula. And here, you look at the U.S. expectations of walls, physical and political, coming down, and you would see a new reality of new barriers going up that would be economic and social going up instead. With this type of development, I think we run up against how the Chinese would react. In foreign policy terms, I think the Chinese will be very consistent in adhering to their non-intervention principle in the internal affairs of other states. But in economic terms, I think China would be very interested in drawing some of these North Korean workers, former North Koreans, as workers in China. The economic reality in China, as labor costs rise, the demand for labor is going up quite a bit. And already we have an estimate of about 80,000 North Korean workers in China. That figure is likely to grow in a situation of the continued division of the Korean Peninsula or in a reunification situation. So it'll be very interesting to see how the China-North Korea, China-South Korea interests compete with respect to the new political economy reality in this type of reunification situation. So let me just, in this particular section, dig a little deeper in terms of the defector factor here. With this, I think there are three important parts to look at. The first, as I mentioned earlier, the applying and leveraging of forming local political groupings to advocate for particular rights and extending those lessons learned and those practices to a situation on the ground in the former North Korea. The second is to seek to add to the local voice in terms of development of the tremendous mineral resources in the northeastern corridor of the Korean Peninsula. Advocating for local interests, local rights, that is going to be very interesting because if they do achieve the first part, they will have a legitimate voice of sorts that would have to be contended with. And then the third part is promoting integration of the local economy with the local economy of neighboring countries. So this is a story of frontier economies. It's not necessarily the grand bargains between the countries and the capitals, but already we're seeing practices and behavior in the border region between North Korean provinces and Chinese provinces that really talk about the concept of this contiguous sub-regional border. That is not likely to go away in a reunification situation. I think you have to look at that prospect increasing because those patterns of behavior and mutual benefits that both sides, both groups in the frontier economies have been realizing will only increase. So here it goes to the broader question of how competition for legitimacy between Seoul's plan and the defector community's plan plays out and how that influences the manner in which the regional neighbors respond to reunification. This is, I think, an element that hasn't been looked at before, but is going to be significant. The third section here, building trust by verifying dismantlement of North Korea's arsenal. Irrespective of what happens in the short term, this is viewed by policymakers as a reality in the region going forward. It has to be addressed. It's a question of when, not if. And in the security sphere, the near-term competing interests regarding reunification, I think, can be aligned. Not to say that this is one area where you solve all of the competing interests and difficulties, but rather a very nascent beginning that if you harness this potential, provides a very rare element of common interest. And it's because there's a collective goal here that's recognized by all the parties involved, the collective need for dismantling and multilaterally verifying the dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. That is increasingly a common principle that is reiterated a lot in Track 1.5 and some Track 1 meetings as well. So here, if we look at the specific task-oriented approach, this is a formative experience that, again, if it can be harnessed, can be very powerful in terms of triggering substantive security cooperation in a region that really has none. And so with this, if you look at the details involved in nuclear dismantlement, and here not only the physical, but also the human capital, what to do with the former North Korean nuclear technicians and nuclear engineers, that part of moving them away from those type of practices and integrating them into a different type of behavior, I think is a part of the dismantling process. And here also the physical cleanup of some of these storage sites that are very terribly, and I think in some cases, widespread contamination. This is going to take at least a decade or more. And so when you look at that type of timeline, you're going to require regional cooperation for multilateral planning implementation. So in practice, this means that you'll have to develop a policy dialogue mechanism. And this is important to help inform the development and coordination of national policies. Here, to the extent that we have living memory, institutional memory, the Keto model would be an important area for lessons learned in an operational sense. The political fate of the Keto model is something that something that shouldn't be overlooked, but I'm not focusing on that part, but the operational history of Keto when in fact it was run. So moving specifically into this area of the policy dialogue mechanism, this formative foundation, I think, can be used as a basis for larger discussions in the regional security context. And again, it's a building block that potentially we can use to scale up as you address some of the issues related to reunification. Let me wrap up here with some concluding thoughts. While reunification is likely to trigger a lot of the competing interests that analysts have been watching very, very carefully, the regional powers, there's a necessity to leverage the common goals, the very rare common goals, and to help navigate through the turbulent changes through these common goals. And so I cited the example of the operational challenges of dismantling, but there are other areas as well. So if we can use that lens, I think there will be other important building blocks to use. And this is critical because Northeast Asia is a region where there has been chronic misalignment of shifting policy priorities. That, I think, is a tragedy of the region. And managing these patterns you'll always encounter setbacks. That is the reality of the region, and it's likely to grow, not decrease over time. But with that kind of growth, the thinking has to be what will be commensurate as we think of different mechanisms to try to manage these type of issues, the ultimate goal of trying to address them in the medium term. And here, you'll always hear policy recommendations always highlighting the necessity of sustained political leadership and support. And so I won't miss out on that point as well. I mean, clearly you're going to have a group of political leaders that are in this together, that will be investing their finite political capital in this endeavor. Because as we look at these various issues, they can be a catalyst for creating durable security and stability in the region. This isn't a lofty goal, but a necessity. I think if it's reiterated more and more as a necessity, there will be this opportunity for each of the countries to look at their own experiences and try to introduce them, modify them, and scale them up. The alternative here is the myopic management of the reunification process that will likely exacerbate the historic animosities and mistrust, thereby creating, and I think in some cases, deepening divisions in the region. I apologize for ending on a really down note, but I also want to introduce some aspect of the gravity of this situation.
Thank you, Dr. Park. Our second speaker is Professor Yeol, or Yu. Professor Yu is the former Dean of the Graduate School of Public Administration at Korea University. And currently, he is a professor and director of North Korean Studies at Korea University. And he has been responsible for teaching undergraduate and graduate students on inter-Korean relations as well as North Korean politics and foreign policy. Prior to taking up his position at Korea University, he was a research fellow at the Korean Institute for National Unification, where he worked as a director for unification policy and also Office of Planning and Budget and several other units. He's also currently the president of the Korean Political Science Association and also led various academic associations related to North Korea and study of the country. He is also a prolific author. Among his publications are Socialism in North Korea, Construction and Frustration, which is a Korean language publication from 2004. He's also co-authored North Korean Policy Towards Overseas Koreans, and also the North Korean Political System. He graduated from Korea University with a BA and MA from the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and his PhD is from Ohio State University. Professor Yu.
Thank you very much. So, thank you for a kind introduction. And as you mentioned, that I'm now president of Korean Political Science Association, and we are going to have a World Congress for Korean Politics this August. So I just came here to not just to present on this particular topic, but I also introduce our World Congress in August. Welcome anyone who wants to participate. We are going to have a World Congress at Korea University this time. Well, I think John Bach made a wonderful presentation, and I think it's very creative design or effort to make unification into a very academic or theoretical perspective. But my presentation is about the current issues, because unification or policy on unification depends on who will lead the politics in both North and South Korea. So I briefly talk about the situation on Korean Peninsula these days, and try to introduce what new government in South Korea, Park Geun-hye government, is trying to achieve to achieve unification during her 5-year term. And I try to make a brief analysis on what North Korea new leader Kim Jong-un would try to achieve. I don't know whether he had terms, but he's now only 29 years. And considering his grandfather and father's reign in North Korea, I think he will continue to govern North Korea at least 30 to 40 years from now. If we cannot achieve unification, so that's so I just brief about what North Koreans had in mind to control the situation. And also, finally, I would like to talk about the neighboring countries' policy on the unification on the Korean Peninsula. Well, as I mentioned, whenever we talk about inter-Korean relations, there are at least 4 major variables, and it's very fluctuating. The first one is South Koreans' domestic politics. Well, South Korea had pursued a kind of a democratic politics since its foundation, but recently it has a kind of a successful democratization, and therefore public opinion or different political sections in South Korea had a great influence in creating or in pursuing unification or inter-Korean politics as well. The second variable is about the North Korea. Well, 2 years ago we observed a power transition in North Korea since Kim Il-sung's death in 1994. And therefore, even though they continue to take the same principle and system, but we are carefully watching what happened on the Kim Jong-un, the young leaders North Korea. And the third variable is the neighboring countries' policy. Well, last year and this year, we have 6 countries surrounding the Korean Peninsula, and most countries, including Russia, had experienced the regime or leadership changes. And therefore, at this time, it is time for all the neighboring countries to make their own policy toward each other and toward the Korean Peninsula. So I think it's very important to look at what policy directions or policy options those countries will take. The last variable is the international structure and order. I think we are going to see what the US and China rivalry or relationship would now it's not a crisis in a matter, but the situation is not good enough to talk about the unification in a peaceful way, because the North Korea had maintained a hardline or hawkish attitude toward South Korea, and also over the last 5 years, Lee Myung-bak government, which ended it on this February 25th, had a very sour relationship. And also the kind of situation in South Korea in Korea has been determined by the North Korea's effort to develop its nuclear weapons. In 2009 and 2013 this year, North Korea defeated its nuclear test, the second and third. And the third nuclear test is very important because we cannot recognize North Korea as a nuclear power state, but there is no doubt that North Korea has developed its capability to make it a kind of a weapon to be delivered through a long-range missile in a year or two. So if North Korea, as they wish it, to become a nuclear power state, I think it has a great impact on the whole situation on the Korean Peninsula, including the unification process on the Korean Peninsula. So I think the inter-Korean relations is now it's not a good condition to talk about a peaceful unification this time. Well, I think this year is the 60 years anniversary of armistice on the Korean Peninsula. But as North Korea declared these days, the situation on the Korean Peninsula has become a very serious situation. Because there are at least 2 or 3 major agreements between North Korea and South Korea, or North Korea with the international community, United Nations. But North Korea declared or denounced that there will be no agreement on the Korean Peninsula to maintain peace and stability. And also, North Korea broke up the inter-Korean agreement to not to develop nuclear weapons, as well as non-aggression agreement between the two sides. So technically, South Korea is, or the Koreans, both North and South Korea, in a situation to continue the war, which was broken up in 1950. So I think this kind of situation made us to worry about the future on the Korean Peninsula. However, therefore, I think it's very important to see what the new leaders in South Korea would take to resolve this kind of crisis or this kind of seriousness on the Korean Peninsula. Well, I would like to talk about the new leadership in Korea. The Park Geun-hye, the first female president in Korea, she inaugurated in February 25th. And that inaugural speech is a little bit surprising to all of us, because at that time, North Korea already declared or renounced the truce agreement or the non-aggression agreement between the two Koreas. As we had expected, Park Geun-hye mentioned that it is time for South Korea to maintain a strong deterrence against aggression from North Korea. However, she continued to talk about that she will maintain her promise to build a trust between North and South Korea. And therefore, the key word for us to expect under Park Geun-hye's government in terms of unification is how to achieve trust. Well, I think it's not a new concept or word on the Korean Peninsula, but I think it's very interesting to see what the trust politics means to us. Well, Jong-hye mentioned that Korean, whenever we talk about unification in South Korea, we try to apply Jong-un experience to us. But I think it's very reasonable because both East and West Germany was divided by ideology and different systems, and they competed each other. But because Germany achieved a peaceful unification more than 30 years ago, I think it's very natural for South Korea to believe that we could follow the same steps on the Korean Peninsula. And therefore, I don't know whether Park Geun-hye or his government to apply such kind of German experience or German effort to us by applying the concept of trust. As West Germans pursue a Ost politics, a South Korean new government tried to conceptualize trust plus politics together, trust politics. So I think it's time for us to how to manage or how to develop this kind of new concept on the Korean Peninsula, trust politics. And it is time for us to review what North Korea means to when they broke up the non-aggression pact between the two sides, which was agreed in 1991, right after the collapse of East Germany, and they observed the situation in German unification. And therefore, I think it is very important to us to develop this kind of new concept to understand or to realize unification. Well, I think there are three conditions or three steps for Park Geun-hye government to achieve peace and stability and unification. The first one is the new government in Korea try to achieve a sustainable peace by increasing or improving the deterrence against a new type of threat from North Korea. Well, as we all know that in 2015, the South Korean defense system will be changed. Since the end of Korean War, the U.S. command controlled the wartime and peacetime command in South Korea. But in 1994, the command during the peacetime has been returned to South Korea, and the wartime command control should be returned to South Korea by the year 2012. But because of the sinking of Cheonan vessel 3 years ago, both South Korea and the U.S. Government agreed to delay until the end of 2015. And the situation in Korean Peninsula is now not a good condition, as I mentioned earlier. But the government, the Park Geun-hye government, tried to maintain the peace by maintaining deterrence and to applying the nuclear umbrella from the U.S. And they promised again that the period to get the wartime command by the year 2015 will be maintained. And the second step or second condition for realizing security and sustainable peace is to achieve unification in a peaceful manner. And the third condition is to maintain a kind of diplomacy by maintaining a balance between the neighboring states. Well, the key point of the unification formula under Park Geun-hye government is to realizing a kind of new concept, happiness, happy and unified Korean Peninsula. Well, Park Geun-hye mentioned, repeated to mentioning on the happiness for the Korean population, 100% happiness, and and therefore unification should be achieved in a peaceful and happy happiness. We don't know yet how she or how our government to articulate the happiness, the happy unification, but I think we should recognize her idea or her principle to achieve by applying such kind of a trust politics as well as happiness together. And I think the trust and happiness is a new concept compared to the Lee Myung-bak government. Even though both governments maintain the pursue the same type of ideology, is conservative government, so it is not possible to see a kind of regime change on the Korean Peninsula, but definitely there should be a leadership changes. And therefore we need to compare what the difference between Lee Myung-bak government position or policy toward the unification and the policy direction under Park Geun-hye. Well, as we all know that Lee Myung-bak government main focus in the issue of unification is to achieve denuclearization and openness and the US $3,000. That means that if North Korea agreed to denuclearization and then North Korea pursue a open as Chinese had done 20 or 30 years ago, then South Korea, along with the international community, to support or to assist North Korea to make their per capita GNP to $3,000 US in 10 years. That's Lee Myung-bak government policy guidelines or direction. Of course, North Korea denied such kind of principle or policy directions as that it's a kind of a peaceful transition or a regime transformation, and therefore they would not support and they would not cooperate with the Lee Myung-bak government. And they called it or denounced it as an economic type of unification formula. And therefore, Park Geun-hye's position is kind of a new type of political formula. That means that if both North and South Korea agree to maintain or build trust, then Park Geun-hye government would continue to have a humanitarian assistance, and then it could achieve some kind of consensus to talk about unification. So I think the inter-Korean dialogue under Park Geun-hye, there are three major types of tasks. The first one is that the Park Geun-hye government should succeed in build confidence or trust. And the second one is, as I mentioned, that South Korea is a totally democratic country. So unification policy or inter-Korean policy, all those kind of policies toward North Korea should be support among South Koreans, among different sections of political parties. So I think the Park Geun-hye's leadership should be achieve those kind of internal consensus. And the third one is a kind of a precondition as we had pursued over the last 20 years to resolve North Korea nuclear problem. Well, Kim Jong-un, who had followed what his father or grandfather had made in North Korea, that they believe, they assume that the nuclear weapons is the only way for them to survive. And if they could survive, I think it's very difficult for us to achieve a peaceful unification at that point. So I think we need to achieve denuclearization, not just for the peace and order surrounding the Korean Peninsula, but it is very important to achieve a peaceful unification. because of time limitation, I would skip to the almost last point, and then I could get questions and then answer to my argument. Well, there are a couple of tasks for Park Geun-hye government to achieve unification. Well, I think the first one is that Korea, I think it's a democratic country's limitation. Well, I think of course it's very important to maintain liberty and freedom and democracy, but such a divided country like Korea, the 5-year term is very difficult to maintain such kind of a consistency on the unification formula or policy, compared to such kind of dictatorial system like North Korea, which maintained over the for 30 or 40 years. So I think we have to make a consensus among ourselves to maintain a long-term policy views, and that is the first task that Park Geun-hye government should consider. And the last point is the probably William will take that position of how to create or build environment for peaceful unification surrounding the Korean Peninsula. But I think it's very important for us to maintain a trust diplomacy among our allies as well as our neighboring countries. Well, recently, the new leadership in Beijing, Xi Jinping, is trying to consider which policy is better for their own national interests, as well as to maintain peace and stability in East Asia. And therefore, the new leader in Beijing, Xi Jinping, and new leader in South Korea, Park Geun-hye, had frequent contact to resolve not just the nuclear issues, but how to resolve the deadlock situation on the Korean Peninsula, as well as I think they are talking about how to deal with the North Korea problems to achieve unification. I think it's very positive at this moment. And also, the South Korea and the U.S. had a better position following a solid alliance between Lee Myung-bak government and Obama administration over the last 4 years. And therefore, I think Park Geun-hye government finally decided to have the first summit with the President Obama. Well, I don't think that is not the realistic approach to consider which is the priority to observe the time of summit. But in Korea, when Park Geun-hye elected, and during the transition period, there are a lot of report analysis to how to manage the foreign policy in the situation of power transition. And therefore, Park Geun-hye government didn't like to send an envoy, special envoy, to major countries, which was a kind of customs, political custom in South Korea over the last 20 years. So whenever a new president elected, they sent or dispatched a special envoy to U.S. and China and Japan and Russia. But this time they didn't follow that kind of systems. However, Chinese had sent their own special envoy to Park Geun-hye, president-elect in January, and they discussed about to exchange envoys. And therefore, Park Geun-hye decided to send a political envoy to Beijing. And therefore, there was a kind of a report that it is time for South Korea to have a first summit with the Chinese leaders. Of course, the relationship between U.S. and South Korea there is absolutely no doubt about the importance and significance between the two countries. But to resolve such kind of deadlock situation on the Korean Peninsula, Chinese influence is very important, and therefore it is time for new government to try to change Chinese attitude or policy toward North Korea by having a first summit with Chinese leaders. But however, because of North Korea's continued provocations and the security issues became the top priority, and therefore I think there should be no surprise to see the Korean Peninsula or the level of diplomacy. But anyhow, as we had discussed yesterday in this room about the CJK FDA issues, and therefore I think if we want to achieve peaceful unification, or if we have some kind of expectation to achieve unification in our lifetime, then I think it is time for us to make a very creative effort by having a different or multiple channels to get support from our neighboring countries. And therefore, I think the 6 particles still is the most important multilateral channel to resolve nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula, as well as to create or build trustship among neighboring countries. But also we should develop a triple or four-party dialogue to talk about how to achieve a unification. And that's the task of Park Geun-hye government. Thank you.
Our final speaker today is Dr. Abraham Kim. As he mentioned earlier, he is the Vice President of the Korea Economic Institute of America. And as such, he oversees the KI's research programs and publications. In his personal research, he covers a wide range of issues related to U.S.-Korea relations, including foreign policy, trade investment issues, regional security, and political patterns or behaviors of the Korean-American community. Prior to joining the KI, he was the research manager of government services and the principal Korea analyst at the global political risk consulting firm, Eurasia Group. He's also given many interviews to the media and advised private sector and public sector agencies. Dr. Kim received his BA from Boston University, his MA from Harvard University, and his PhD in political science from Columbia University. Dr. Kim.
It's a real honor to be here. I've been at this platform multiple times over the last few days, so it's nice to be back here. I just want to say that basically you've gotten all the meat, and now you're getting the dessert, which is my presentation is intended to be it'll be a little bit more provocative, not to really provide any answers, but hopefully to generate more questions. And I'm going to be taking and approaching this question from a 30,000 feet, meaning it'll be more conceptual than empirical, as my previous speakers have done. But in the end, I hope this will create some thought and perhaps provoke a lot of discussion afterwards. So basically, I've broken up my presentation into 2 parts. One is an overview of the reunification debate. What are some of the ideas, the dominant ideas out there? And then apply an alternative perspective, which is on strategic bargaining, cooperation, and national identity politics. And as John mentioned, hopefully this is kind of the beginning of trying to establish, building an analytical framework. So I started off my doing this paper project by asking myself, what causes states to decide to reunify peacefully? I think a lot of people, we ask the question, well, what's going to cause peaceful unification? How do we get peaceful unification? But I think the better question is, what would cause states to decide to unify peacefully? And so, as I was writing that, I realized 35 pages into this, it was too long. So I decided to scope it down and say, why is it so difficult to achieve? And start building an analytical framework. So I went into the library and started looking at all the reunification literature out there, and sure enough, there are a lot of stuff out there. But unfortunately, a lot of it is really not really getting to the theory of things, but really addressing a lot of policy work, journalistic accounts, and not a lot of not dealing with essential questions. What causes states to decide to reunify peacefully? So basically, I found three broad approaches or perspectives, and here is your reunification triad. There are essentially two states within an identity community, and they're trying to get together to reunify peacefully. So one approach I found it's called the ethno-nationalist perspective. Basically, you and I are Korean, you and I are Chinese, therefore at some point in the future, because we share this common history together, we will be unified. Regardless of our historical conflicts and contention, somehow this national identity will bring us together as one. The problem is this tells you why we might want unification, but it doesn't tell you how we're going to get unification. And it doesn't answer the question of why we have 60 years in Korean history, for example, and strong national identity on both sides, but no unification. It's a primordial view of nationalism. It has a very fixed view of nationalism, and as we know, national identity changes over time. And we have Professor Gil Roth, who wrote a fantastic book on national identity. And the idea there is that, over time, people think about who they are, what their ethnic identity may change over time. Right? And that might impact how they view reunification. And finally, nationalism, or a common national identity can contribute to cooperation, but we've also seen that national identity, people we share common identity, that can be a community of competition, especially if my group and their group have different views on what values or what philosophy should be, or ideology should rule or organize that community. It could be, if we're different, then this identity community could be a realm for competition. So having an ethno-national identity means it's indeterminate whether it will promote unification or not. Second approach is called neo-functionalist or integration perspective, and as many of you know, this is very popular during the European integration, formation of European Union, but the whole idea is this kind of low level of engagement, cultural, economic, will eventually lead to increased trust, to political cooperation, and eventually inspire reunification. Problem is it's very Eurocentric. It came out because of the European integration, and assuming all the states that are involved have the same rules of the game. But in case of North and South Korea, for example, they function on very different ideologies of how to deal with issues. And so that's a problem. This is, the functionalist approach is very normative. This is how we should do it, not necessarily how it causes states to lead to unification. And third, it's very theologically and over idealistic. It's assumed that there's kind of a linear progression towards something. But as we know, in politics, nothing is linear. It's as states, especially when it's dealing with power interests. They cooperate, but their cooperation breaks. So it's not necessarily building upon each other. But I think the last point is probably one of the most important points, is that we think about cooperation. We think of cooperation as one form of cooperation, interstate cooperation. And there's a difference between interstate cooperation and power sharing, because interstate cooperation you and I cooperate as separate states, but in the end, the final product is we all do better because the value goes up. But in the issue of power sharing, you and I cooperate, but by strengthening you, it could in the end disadvantage me in the power sharing end, right? Because my intent is to get more power in the final state, right? The final country. And so there's this kind of mixed incentive going on when you're dealing with cooperation in power sharing arrangements. And then finally, there's the collapses perspective. And this is very popular during the 1990s when North Korea, of course, was going through some difficult economic situation. And there were a lot of authors such as Nick Everstad and Aidan Foster Carter who suggested that, okay, if North Korea collapses, then it will lead to unification. Well, there's some problems with that. And one of my old professors, Samuel Kim, that's his quote, he said, the problem with this collapses perspective, one is the fallacy of premature economic reductionism. What does that mean? Well, essentially, economic collapse does not necessarily lead to political collapse. And the question is does political collapse necessarily lead to reunification? No one explains that causal linkage between collapse and unification. They just make that logical leap from collapse to unification. And so it's not quite clear. And the other thing is we've already talked about the German model or the German absorption model. And if you actually look at what happened in Germany leading up to 1990, 1991, even how Germany's reunification occurred was not very clear. It wasn't very clear that German unification would have happened because really there were three possible endings for Germany when East Germany was in trouble. One was it could have unified under Article 23 of the Basic Law, which was an immediate unification, which is eventually what happened. But there was Article 146 where it said that it can be a gradual negotiated reunification between West and East Germany. And then there was what's called the third way, and that's what we literally call it, the third way, where there would be a coexistence of two states, and East Germany would be a social democracy, and the perpetuation of two states. So even in the German model, there's a lot of post hoc historic revisionism going on here, but even in the German case, it wasn't an obvious direct causal linkage from collapse to unification. So the basic line is the conceptual underpinning of reunification debate so far needs some work. And so what I'm proposing here is to not really go into a lot of deep discussion about strategic bargaining and national identity politics, but what I want to do is tease out some ideas from the literature, this rich literature, and help us understand better, or perhaps ask more questions about what will cause unification, or why would it make it more difficult. So basically, strategic bargaining, in the simplest sense, this is what strategic bargaining looks like, right? There's basically two states, and they have, state one and state two have interests, and they have a range of agreements that they were willing to make. And based on cost benefits, they will determine how close or their interests or how their agreements will overlap. So at some point, these two are called reservation values will overlap, and that overlap area is what areas of agreement to be negotiated. And wherever the states end up, it will have different payoffs for the state. So from this literature, there's a whole host of really rich, interesting insights that come out. And there's some great authors that have really provided interesting insights to states or countries that are in strategic bargaining situations where the stakes are very high. And a couple of authors I'd like to point out. One is, of course, James Furon, back from our PhD days. Scott Harold here. I've read a lot of his work. But basically, he wrote a very great article, and basically it's about states in high stakes agreement or agreements that have long-term implications. And basically, his bottom line was the longer the time horizon of the agreement is, the greater incentive to lock in a better distribution advantage in the agreement. Otherwise, they won't reach an agreement. They'll keep pushing it off. Because in the end, as long as the cost of non-cooperation is low, state leaders will resist committing themselves to a settlement, hoping their opponent will eventually capitulate. So what does that mean? It means if the final agreement that you're making has long-term, high-stakes implication, then it's in the incentive for the states just to keep delaying making a commitment. Push it off, until they can reach an agreement that it would advantage them. Because any kind of distributional advantage they get, if you project it out into indefinite period, you will continue to value much, much more. And that's why realist gain, as the third point here, relative gain becomes even more important. The more I can get now with this agreement, if you project it out, in the end, that might give me the additional advantage in this power sharing mechanism to eventually become the dominant player in this new state. So if you have these problems or these hurdles to reach an agreement, then the question is, what will push these states to make an agreement? What will put the high cost on states to compel them to reach a reunification agreement? So there's another interesting body of work called post-war state building, post-Civil War state building literature that actually looks at civil wars and how Civil War states in Civil War situations reach and build a power-sharing arrangement. And this is, and they use strategic bargaining as well. What's interesting is that both this reunification and state building after Civil War involves a common challenge of compelling political elites to work together toward building a single state, right? And they all both involve trying to do this when states are very contentious or very competitive. But even in this literature, it says getting these two competing powers to achieve a power sharing arrangement in the end is extremely difficult. But of course, the difference between what occurs in Civil War and reunification is Civil War, we're in an armed conflict situation. That is the main driver that shifts the cost and benefits of these two players. But in the reunification case, there is no war. So the question is what is this driving factor that are changing the calculations, the cost-benefit calculations of the states that are in reunification? It's not clear. Is it the economic competition? Is it the political competition? Are these enough pressures to put the states under enough duress to get them to consider reunification as a serious mechanism, right? As you can see, all the pressure points are gone, and so no. So this brings me up to a second, but perhaps even a controversial point, which is, well, if pressure and costs of the current status quo pushes states to consider reunification as a serious option, then if a country like North Korea faces trouble, should we intervene? Or should any outside state help out? Because if that's the pressure that will get these countries to decide toward deciding to pursue peaceful unification, then should we intervene is a question I'm asking. But what's interesting here is that what we often don't understand is that there are trade-offs. So if we decide to stabilize a situation like that, are we defraying or contributing toward the state by stabilizing the state for them to delay the decision to pursue peaceful unification? Because if unification is the only alternative to get out of an unstable situation, then by stabilizing the situation, you're delaying the decision to make decision to go to unification. The second characteristic or literature I'd like to draw from is the national identity community, or the national identity, political identity literature. And as I already mentioned, these two states are bargaining and they're in a common community. But in fact, what this common community, being in the same community, make unification, or the bargaining toward unification, more difficult. Let me provide some context. Of course, we're all probably familiar with the nationalism literature. Nationalism, of course, as Ernst Gellner says, nationalism is critical for the legitimacy of the state. The state is essentially the defender of the nation. But the problem with the unification cases, this nationalism is mixed with ideological competition, as we see in the North-South Korea case, and China-Taiwan, and even East-West Germany, which makes the mixture of nationalism and the ideological competition makes this relationship extremely contentious. And they're fighting for the hearts and minds of the people on both sides, claiming that they are the legitimate government of this nation. But the problem is and this is drawing from Adam Przeworski, is that, and this is for regime change, but I think it applies here to reunification case as well, because as it states, as long as no collective alternatives are available, individual attitudes toward the regime matter little for its stability. What is threatening to authoritarian regimes is not the breakdown of legitimacy, but the organization of counter-hegemony, the collective projects for an alternative future. The problem in the case of reunification dyad is that the country right across the DMZ is the counter-hegemony. There's always a perpetual model for the alternative Korea, the alternative Germany, the alternative China-Taiwan, for example. And so what happens over there? If they are stronger, then that could potentially have implications on your own legitimacy, because people are constantly, your citizens are constantly comparing what's going on the other side. And so one of the important implications from this is perhaps reunification, what's making this collaboration or this move toward reunification more difficult is that these two states are in a perpetual state of a security dilemma. Second implication is okay, what happens if perhaps these two states are engaged and they are, a lot of cultural exchanges are occurring and political exchanges and economic exchanges are occurring. And given that states are self-preserving, and this, as I just mentioned, this national identity community creates the sense of vulnerability between the two states. What if there's increased opening, like an Ostpolitik, or a sunshine policy, or other kinds of engagement? Well, based on the insights that I presented, we would expect the weaker of the two states to feel increasingly insecure, especially if the disparity between the two states are very stark. And so, what would happen? And so, what I'm suggesting, and perhaps, and even the empirical data perhaps even shows, is that this will begin to lead the weaker state may consider redefining their identity so that they don't feel as vulnerable. So, for example, this happened in Germany, East-West Germany, Ostpolitik, 1972. When the borders and exchange started increasing between West and East Germany, Erich Honecker implemented a policy of what's called demarcation. He started changing the constitution and saying, you know what? East Germans, we're no longer Germans anymore. We're actually socialists. And so starting to redefine their identity. So even though there is increased opening, that their citizens will no longer say, oh, I'm German, they're German, and they're living better. But rather, they're German, but we're socialists, and if they're living better or so forth, it won't have it won't have as much of an impact. And perhaps even, and maybe this is worth discussing later, but also maybe that's something similar is happening in China, Taiwan as well, the Taiwanese identity. After Jong-un came into power and the increased exchange, I know the Taiwan identity and its significance started to take off in a significant way among the Taiwanese. So, with that, I just wanted to present to you take some theoretical ideas, apply it onto reunification, and hopefully generate some interesting questions and perhaps and stimulate some ideas for further research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all three presenters. I'll try to keep my comments relatively brief. But first I shall preface my comments by saying that these papers will be collected into a volume that will be published in apparently 2 or 3 months after the conference. So as a form of outlining my comments, I'll go mathematically. 3 points of 3s, 2 points of 2s, and 1. And then we'll open up the floor for discussions. So what are the 3 points? At the very simplest level, there are 3 speakers. So that's 1, 3. The second 3, there are 3 overlapping, interlinked, but distinct questions that are being asked. So to simplify their papers, Dr. Park asked, what are the incentives for unification for all stakeholders? And what kind of, I suppose, prescriptive advice can an advisor give as one of the implicit questions he was asking. The second paper by Professor Yu is asking, again, simplified form, is how is the South Korean government preparing for unification, as well as regional players? How should President Park develop, disseminate, implement, monitor for unification policies? And the third paper by Dr. Kim, you could say, was asking when, in other words, under what conditions unification might occur. So these are 3 interlinked questions. You could also say that this is a third 3. They're defined in some respects by 3 distinct approaches. And I think Dr. Park mentioned that his was an abstract paper. I think each paper probably qualified their paper by saying theirs was abstract. But let's call Dr. Park's an intermediate approach. It's not theory the way many political scientists or IR people would recognize it. It is, however, an analytic and prescriptive approach to unification at an intermediate level of abstraction. So you have a lot of interesting prescriptive ideas. Professor Yu's paper we shall simplify as an empirical approach, so rather an intermediate approach. So to discuss the specifics of what domestic and external factors would help develop potentially useful unification policies. And the third paper with Dr. Kim, he called abstract, I would call simply theoretical. There's obviously existing literature he's drawing from. And we'll call this, strategic bargaining, scenario building. Okay. So there are 3 interlinked points. Now let's get to the two twos. So the first point I will make is that all papers are essentially trying to negotiate and explore the spaces between 2 scenarios for political unification. So one is peaceful and one is hostile. The other, you could say, is between incorporation and confederation. So there's 2, within the established literature, there's incorporation, which is, you could say, structural assimilation, and confederal. So we can think of many examples, including the EU, that have confederal approaches. And we could actually make the argument that unification policy in South Korea and North Korea since the late 60s have been essentially confederal in substance, if not in legal terms. I don't know if other people would agree. But they're negotiating, exploring the spaces between these poles. Okay? We'll break the mathematical pattern and say, you could say that there's another pole between intensification of government control and extensification. So if you're a government official, you can intensify control over population, territory, space, resources, or you can extensify, you can expand spaces. In reality, of course, these processes occur simultaneously. But again, all 3 authors are exploring the spaces between these 2 poles. Now, what's the second 2? Well, 2 questions for each speaker. Okay? And these don't have to be answered. What we can do is simply put the questions out on the floor and open up the floor for discussions. Okay? So for Dr. Park, this is a rather large question, so again, this is why I said you don't have to answer it now. I'm sure you've had this experience many times. When a political scientist looks at a policy studies paper and they read something about track 1.5 or 2, the question they often ask, not to generalize about political scientists, of course, is how do you measure impact? How do you quantify it? Or if it's qualitative, how do you measure then qualitative benchmarks that these initiatives need to clear? The second question for you is, you mentioned, I think, that integrating defector voices is extremely difficult currently, as well as in the future. So this is, I suppose, a question solidly within the realm of policy studies. What are the solutions then? Now, we can think of, for example, the balloon incident last year, where a group of defectors were very active, wanted to release the balloons. The local residents and municipal authorities wanted to stop them. And even that little incident was difficult to resolve. So in fact, they did release the balloons. Just wasn't reported that widely in the media. Okay, 2 questions for Professor Yu. Let me then invoke some formal modeling language. So one of the questions you asked, very interesting one, we'll call the dependent variable, is what are the factors that shape South Korea's unification policies? And you mentioned 4 independent variables, the factors that explain these policies. You mentioned South Korean domestic politics, North Korea, or changes within North Korea, regional powers, and the international security order. So again, going back to some political science style thinking, which of these 4 independent variables then do you think are the most important? Because after all, we can list the 4, but which ones realistically have the most weight would be the key. Second question for Professor Yu. You mentioned deterrence as an essential element in building trust and happiness for everyone around the world, especially on the Korean Peninsula. So I was wondering if you could, well, maybe during the discussion you could bring this up. Internet attacks, hacking has been a major issue, an emerging one. And I was wondering then how, in the face of consistent and increasing sophisticated attacks by virtual means, as well as the usual rhetoric, threatening death and destruction to all, can we then combine deterrence with happiness and trust? Now you could say, well, we probably ask questions like that all the time. How do we protect ourselves from threats while fostering trust and happiness? But in this particular instance, relate to internet attacks with this dilemma be resolved or resolvable. 2 questions for Dr. Kim. I thought one of the very interesting things you did was move the scenario building from the typical dyad, 2 actors, to include some other players. So you moved it from a dyad to a multiplayer game, although you allocated more space to building up the dyad. Now, everything you seem to be saying seems to point to the reality that essentially the Korean Peninsula is caught in what we might call entropy or stasis. People are repeating the same thing over and over. So we can talk about systemic entropy or systemic lag. You use the term perpetual security game. So again, you don't have to answer this question now, but is there not then room for some conceptual value added here? Right? Although you critique the linear approach to political union, in a sense there has been relatively little work theoretically on explaining stasis. You started, I think, down this road when you said the costs of non-agreement are not particularly, if the costs are not high, then there would be less incentive to agree. But I think there could be very interesting contribution from work on explaining entropy or stasis. Okay, the second question, well, I actually had several, and I had to change them as I heard you talk. Okay? So I could cheat, maybe ask several. No, I'll stick to one. So then, I think you and the other panelists also mentioned that Germany should not be the end all, the sole benchmark, right, the sole precedent. So then, what kind of precedents are there? Now, we can think of Cameroon, but we can also think of the Federation of Malaya, okay, Soviet Union, Serbia and Montenegro, which have a confederal agreement for 3 years. So there's various scenarios that are possible. Unification is certainly not going to be the panacea that resolves all North Korea or the Korean Peninsula's problems. So then what are some of the useful benchmarks you I think, rightly critique the tendency to gravitate around the German example. And one final question for, I suppose, the panelists, but for all of us to consider. The talks essentially focused on why or how would unification occur. But in a sense, the question that seemed to be, I suppose, somewhat overlooked is why is it desirable at all? Why do we need unification? I think Dr. Kim made some starts towards answering this question by talking about ethno-nationalism, neo-functionalism, a few other things. But you could say, what are the costs then for non-unification? There are clearly costs at the individual level for divided families. Right? But for states, what are the costs and what are the incentives? And beyond the rhetoric that all one ethnic group, one linguistic group should unify into one country, beyond that rhetoric, why should the two Koreas unify? I think we do need to actually explore, as Dr. Kim said, the possibilities of the fundamental assumptions driving a lot of the work on unification may be either under-examined or downright problematic, depending on your perspective. So on that point, I shall open it to the floor for questions. When you ask questions, please raise your hand and identify yourself, and then direct the question either at a specific speaker or the entire panel.
Waiting for the mic. I'm going to pick up on our host's mathematical approach, as he determined it to be, and ask three questions also. Professor, you had, I think you have mid-level something or other, but I'm going to change to an empirical question. If we're not in a crisis in inter-Korean relations right now, I have a problem with the definition of the term crisis. North Korea is attacking South Korea. North Korea is threatening to physically attack South Korea as well as your ally. They're threatening the West Sea Islands. They're threatening Seoul. They've torn up the armistice. They've been blocking GPS. I guess I'm just baffled. What does it mean to say North Korea and South Korea are not in a crisis? And if they're not yet, what would determine the two states to be in a crisis? What's the definition? For John, a theoretical question, since you were in a different realm. I think you were playing in the prescriptive realm was the description we got. So, John, how important is China for all this? I mean, Koreans in the debates that I hear in the English language, since I'm not privy to the stuff that many of you all are able to access in the Korean language, but in the English language, Koreans often talk about China as if it's got some real control over North Korea in the reunification process. Not necessarily right now, although there's a lot of anxiety about whether or not China is getting so many resources or buying up all of North Korea. But is China's cooperation really that critical in a reunification scenario? Could China really block reunification? Would China take on North Korea, either sponsoring some kind of a puppet regime if North Korea collapsed, or invading North Korea and annexing it, or standing in the United Nations Security Council and saying, we, Beijing, are going to be the one state that blocks South Korea from reunifying? Because this would set a very bad precedent, of course, if China and Taiwan ever wanted to reunify, if some UN Security Council state was to say, well, I have a veto and I'm going to block, or we are going to block, Beijing from reunifying with Taipei just because we've got a UN seat. So I guess I would just welcome any exploratory thoughts you may have there. And Abe, since you were in the theoretical realm, it's time for you to get prescriptive, I guess. I read your most interesting comment out of this that I took was the question you asked, does external assistance to North Korea delay reunification? And I thought, oh, sunshine. Boy, that was $10 billion that kept North Korea afloat. Chinese aid. Boy, that's more money that keeps North Korea afloat, keeps the Korean Peninsula divided. So if I was to rephrase that in a slightly more provocative way than you actually did, I think I'd say, is aid and assistance to North Korea irresponsible? Is aid and assistance to North Korea, in fact, contrary to South Korea's national security interests? Could you answer that question?
Yes, and before letting go of the mic, please identify.
Oh, I'm sorry. Scott Harold, the Rand Corporation.
And if the three speakers could then answer the question briefly so that we can maximize our time for other questions and discussions. So yes, starting with, we'll say, Professor Yu, and then Dr. Park and Dr. Kim.
Yeah, thank you very much. For the
which is the most important variable to determine the improvement of in the Korean relations. I think the DPRK is the most important variables because I think in the past we thought that the internal conflict in South Korea was a predominant element to decide whether we could achieve improvement of in the Korean relations. But since we had a kind of lessons over the last at least 15 years, we had a vertical and horizontal regime changes, and we are very much proud of our democratization, and therefore we had learned how to compromise, how to reduce tensions in various issues like North Korea policy, and therefore I think as we had observed at the National Assembly, both opposition and ruling parties agreed to condemn North Korea's threat against South Korea, except some extreme leftist groups in South Korea. And therefore, I think domestic situation in South Korea had passed the most difficult period. And also, the situation in surrounding the Korean Peninsula has also learned some lessons over the last 10 to 20 years. Well, the increasing influence of China in this region, in Northeast Asia, had some kind of tension over to the US and Japan and other countries in this region. But I think China also had learned how to compromise, how to cooperate with those neighboring countries. And therefore, we had slightly, I think it's too early for us to expect that China had made a fundamental changes in its policy toward North Korea. But I think the growing number of Chinese citizens had raised their voice against the government position on North Korea, and therefore I think the international or regional powers country had been passed also the most critical point. But the real problem is how to control, or how to achieve changes inside North Korea. Well, I think compared to Kim Jong-il, who had kind of lessons under his father Kim Il-sung over the at least more than 20 years when he became the sole leader in 1994. He calculated the strategic interest, including South Korea. And therefore, I think even though Kim Jong-il had frequent brinkmanship against the U.S., against South Korea, but we thought that we could manage such kind of situation in a better way. But Kim Jong-un is too young and lack of experience, and therefore I think it is more dangerous, or it is unpredictable, or uncertainty under Kim Jong-un. So I think if North Korea really changed its position, and if Kim Jong-un could learn a positive or constructive lessons from his previous leaders, then I think we could expect a better position to deal with more serious issues. However, I think it's too early. So I think the most important variable to resolve the issues on the Korean Peninsula is North Korea. And the second question is the deterrence and the influence or connection to the happiness. I think happiness is one of the two major keywords under Park Geun-hye government. The second one is the trust. Whenever she mentioned in her inaugural speech, the three major elements in her speech or in her policy direction is the people and happiness and trust.
trust. So I think happiness is the key word. And continuity of North Korea's threat against South Korea, I think it's serious, of course. However, as Professor Lynn mentioned, the cyber attacks, we still examine or investigate. At the beginning, we thought that it might North Korea's attack against South Korea, but the recent examination is that it's too early for us to determine that it came from North Korea. So I think we should be more cautious on North Korea's attack against South Korea. It may be connected to your question about how to define the crisis. Well, I think North Korea's verbal attacks against South Korea, against the international community, is really very serious. They mentioned frequently that it is time for us to observe the final destruction. And I think it's a kind of a brutal verbal attacks against South Korea. But I think that they also made it clear that it is there should be some precondition for them to make a physical attack against South Korea. That is that if South Korea or the U.S. Entered into their own territory or into their sea or space, then they would retaliate. So I think there's still conditions for them. So I think if we define crisis, then or physical crisis on the Korean Peninsula, I think we had over 60 years of experience. And well, there are some worries about the indifference among South Koreans. So I think compared to the reaction from international community, I think Koreans are very much adjusted to what North Korea had treated us over the 60 years. So I think we still have time to wait to see what happened in North Korea, and that's what President Park Geun-hye had made in her recent attitude toward North Korea. So still, she emphasized she still believe in her keyword of trust politics in dealing with North Korea. So I think still we have.
And if the other two speakers could address the specific questions and keep it brief, because I think there are a lot of hands up. So.
Sure. With that in mind, let me group the questions. I think both sets of questions were very helpful. But in a macro sense, looking at this divide between political science and policy analysis, policy studies, I think that's very dangerous because the lack of symbiotic relationship, if you bring in the analogy of medical advancements, is because you have research sides of the hospital and the treatment side. Lessons learned in both create medical advancements. In the two separate worlds of political science and policy studies, for a variety of reasons, both, undermine the credibility and the effectiveness of the other. That, I think, has to be a priority, irrespective of the country. How to bridge that is important. And while I use the medical analogy here, I think an area where we see another set of this type of confluence and symbiotic relationship, business schools. Business schools today, the top business schools are truly remarkable places where it is multidisciplinary. You have various projects that look at some innovative research projects and research questions, and in a way that I think there is this growth of knowledge, but most importantly, translation into practices. If you look at political science field, you go to an APSA conference, American Political Science Association conferences. Each panel is so unique in terms of what it's looking at that the focus then becomes on methodology. And rather than looking at what are we getting out of this, the debate is always, were you following the right methodological tools? If you go to other conferences related to regional studies or policy, everything is treated as sui generis. You can't compare this or that. There are no lessons learned that you can compare to derive some kind of insight. So moving from that to the micro, that's the macro picture, the micro. I think as it translates into research on reunification, there are certain realities on the ground that aren't factored into either the political science field or the policy studies field. The reality of the situation is that the globalizing Chinese national economy is now a petri dish for both Koreas. So we have two realities of the two Koreas coexisting in this globalizing Chinese economy. And then we have some bizarre situation going on in the Korean Peninsula. Without factoring in and taking into account what's happening in this globalizing Chinese economy, any type of policy prescription or political science conceptual work on the dynamics in the Korean Peninsula will be done with half of the information at best. So with that, to look at very specifically the question of how important is China in all this and Chinese cooperation, in a geopolitical Beijing interacting with the other countries level, it looks like it's going to be very reactive, very slow. Consultation is going to be a very slow process, consensus building in China. Just the mechanism for doing the type of interagency coordination is a capability that China's actually built. It's non-existent right now. So if you play this out, it's unlikely that we're going to see these dramatic reactions from China. If anything, there will be an immediate paralysis trying to figure out how China should react to the situation. But when you look at, and this is my final point, the South Korean efforts to deal with North Korea, it's missing that element of what the North Koreans are doing in China. Here, the North Koreans have what I call Beijing sunshine policy with Chinese characteristics. The sunshine policy part is misleading because it's this idea that the Chinese are replicating. It's really the Chinese characteristics. Never, even at the height of South Korea's sunshine policy, did you have North Korean state trading companies operating the South Korean national economy. The reality today is that you have North Korean state trading companies operating in every major commercial and transportation hub in China. That is labeled as economic development activity by the Chinese authorities. So it's not even a question of Chinese implementation of financial sanctions. It's categorization. It's immediately categorized as economic development. And the significance of that is that in UN Security Council resolutions, in addition to all the prescribed items and activities, you have this clause, and member states of the United Nations are not prohibited from engaging in economic development and humanitarian activities. So there's your reality, there's your loophole. Any policy prescription, any political science analysis that doesn't take into account that reality, I think you have some fundamental gaps on the science stuff.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Kim?
I know it would take my friend to get me into trouble, so thank you, Scott, for that question. I think what I'm, so your question is aid and assistant irresponsible is South Korea being irresponsible or China being irresponsible to support North Korea? And what I try to present in my presentation is that the goal for peace and stability and the goal for reunification are not necessarily the same. I think the problem that we face is we tend to conflate the two, but they don't necessarily are the same. Because and then also it really depends on the interest of the international community. If it's to stabilize a situation, certainly to stabilize and offer assistance that's the priority, that's important. But I think what people tend to forget that there are trade-offs, right? If you accept the framework that I present as a strategic bargain, then stabilizing the situation will delay reunification. And so, so that's what I was trying to point out with that slide. And but I do this paper is actually derived from part of my dissertation, and what I presented to you was chapter 1. But actually, chapter 2 and onward, the next 300 pages, is explaining how actually states do decide to peacefully unify. That's the next paper. So wait till next year. But there is a case where peace and stability and reunification converge, and they are the same. And if you're interested, I'll let you know.
So what I'd like to do is to collect some questions, so the speakers will have to get their pens ready in order to facilitate discussion. So I saw one hand here, one hand there, and then lots of hands. Okay, so let's collect 3 questions. So 1, 2, 3, and then 2, if that's fine. Okay, so let's start here.
Just a statement first. I mean, I am very supportive of South Korea taking over North Korea, being unification. But Walter Keats, sorry, Asia Pacific Travel.
Could you identify yourself?
Walter Keats, Asia Pacific Travel. Yeah. So I don't know anything about North Korea. I've only been there 29 times, but I'm not an academic. So, but anyway, my concern is that it's not clear that the Koreans, the South Koreans, have figured out. I mean, they act like there's a right here to reunify with North Korea. And it seems to me that that ignores China's interest in the status quo for economic, for defense, etc. And it just seems to me that gets ignored all here as to why China would accept this, peaceful or not. And it seems to me the other question is with North Korea, you talk about trust. I don't see, I mean, North Korea does not recognize South Korea, basically. You're a puppet of the Americans. It seems to me that various things that are being done are actually going to prevent reunification in the short term, such as the ROK taking over control of the military and war thing in 2015. It seems to me this ought to be sooner. Then, if they want to have a peace treaty, they have to deal with who's in charge. The South Koreans. They're equal, not the Americans and their puppets, the South Koreans. And the question of denuclearization, the same thing. How in the world are they going to give up nukes, without all this other stuff being done first? It just seems to me this is what I've called before a perpetual motion machine. I took physics in high school, and they said there was no such thing, but I believe the Korean Peninsula is a perpetual motion machine, and this will never be resolved. So,
and true. Okay, great.
Yeah, I don't need the mic. Okay. Mark Caprio from Nikkei University, now at UCLA. I enjoyed all three papers. And again, similar to your question, there's a third party or fourth party involved in all this process. For Dr. Yu, we have a dilemma here. I agree, trust building measures are critical to solving the problem. But you got North Korea who does not trust and thus has nuclear weapons. You have South Korea that says give up the nuclear weapons, then we'll start thinking about trust. We've got a dilemma here, which involves, of course, the United States. Nuclear weapons aren't aimed at particularly South Korea there because North Korea or the United States has these. How do you build out trust with in this situation, particularly when the U.S. and South Korea are having war games right outside of North Korea's border, if you will, that perpetuated some of the crises that we talked about before. End of question. Thank you.
Okay, so let's identify, yes, the next one in the back, and then we'll go there.
Yeah, Tom Cargill from the University of Nevada at Reno. Over the last 20 years, a lot of fascinating literature on this, and I can understand the motivation of South Korea, but this is really getting like talking about the weather. Nothing really gets changed, and so I have a direct question for each of the paper presenters. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being 100%, what are the chances of unification in the next 10 years? My own view is less than 1. But I'd be curious as to a specific projection from each.
So let's just collect the remaining 2 questions. So there and there.
Donald Clark from Trinity University in San Antonio, historian. For Dr. Yu, you mentioned, and this is something I wrote down from a slide, if resolving North Korea's nuclear problems is a precondition, then you can't take small steps. I mean, you have to have the grand bargain. North Koreans have always said, the deal is we have to give everything up first. Why would we, so how do you reckon that could be, it precludes having small steps, is my point.
And the gentleman over there, yes.
Thanks very much, a very informative panel. This is Bob Sutter from George Washington University. My question is directed to John Park. John, it's a specific issue. How useful are Chinese commentators in the 1.5 dialogues? Because we don't ever know what senior Chinese leaders say to senior North Korean leaders. And Chinese commentators don't know. The Chinese specialists don't know. This is one of the most secret areas in Chinese foreign relations. Whatever transpired between Hu Jintao and Kim Jong-il is not known, period. And then the behavior of China, as you illustrated, is so much against the idea of unification. the consolidation of the relationship, of the type of state structure, seeking the stability that China wants, is just at odds, 180 degrees at odds with the desire of unification. And then the final point, which is probably the most relevant for U.S. policy right now, is that the Chinese won't talk to the Americans about the collapse scenario. They won't even talk to them. So bottom line is, how useful are these Chinese people in the 1.5 battle line, as far as getting a sense of what the Chinese government actually thinks?
Okay, thank you for the questions. So if the speakers could address the questions very briefly. Let's go this time in order of Dr. Park, Dr. Yu, and Dr. Kim.
Sure. Well, I think track 1.5 has to be really viewed as a new type of dialogue, in the sense that usually the track 2 and track 1.5 tend to be confused. The way I distinguish the three, track 1, track 1.5, and track 2 is track 1 is the government level. That's where you have the official meetings, official decision making going on. The second is the mix of current and former policymakers and policy advisors. You have the people who are out of government being able to speak a little more freedom. The current serving government officials being able to ask interesting questions and reveal much more in the way they frame the questions than the answers they give. And then the third, track 2, usually academics and others who address similar types of questions, but with publicly available information where the dependence is on what looks rational, what doesn't. It tends to be a little more theoretical type of discussion. The policy recommendations reveal that a lot. And with respect directly to that question, how useful are the Chinese commentators? In the track 2, I would say not much, because the reality of the situation on the ground is that majority of Chinese academics are gaming their comments to get that MacArthur or that Ford Foundation grant. They're saying some very interesting things, but they are very far removed from what you mentioned, the very discrete channels that exist between the Communist Party of China, the International Liaison Department, and their North Korean counterparts. So even the Chinese Foreign Ministry is cut out in terms of what's going on. So with this, I think there's a necessity for something like a policy R&D mechanism. It's still a work in progress, but if you're able to harvest some of these very difficult questions and send very discrete messages and use that as a basis of more specific track 1.5 dialogues and meetings, that is entering into a space that no one is really working. That is a capacity constrained environment, but a top priority. But when you look at your second question, very specifically, why the Chinese won't talk about collapse scenarios, it's because they have a work in progress, and that is rehabilitating the Workers' Party of Korea. And the Communist Party of China view is if you build up the Workers' Party of Korea as an institution in North Korea, you have a more durable structure there. You can potentially have the basis of economic reform. And ultimately, the realization of not an independent China-North Korea policy, an independent South Korea policy, but what the Communist Party of China calls a balanced Korean Peninsula strategy, which means that if you look at their relationship with South Korea, the Communist Party elites view that as a vibrant pillar that's just becoming more vibrant. But the relationship between the Communist Party of China and the Workers' Party of Korea is seen as a toothpick. And a very brief side note, that is a South Korean reaction to Ostpolitik and the Northern policy, something that reestablished the terms of Beitan on the Korean Peninsula that almost led to the collapse of the North Korean regime, in the sense that South Korea, in return for trade credits to the Chinese and giving the Chinese help in getting wage gains and rehabilitation from kind of 1989, the Chinese agreed to cut off their traditional relationship with North Korea in a very delicate period. But ever since that, there's been something of a lost decade of high-level Communist Party of China Workers' Party relations. And during that period, coincidence and correlation that's still debatable, North Korea cranks up the plutonium production at Yeol. They go in a direction that is very much away from the early 1990s inter-Korean agreements. But the bottom line there is, when you look at these collapse scenarios, the Communist Party of China has their own game plan. They are going to weather the criticisms of so-called coddling their allies, not to be a spokesperson, but to convey some of the key points that come out. But where we can have a discussion is on indicators of stability. If the Chinese are so sensitive about talking instability in North Korea, if we can convert that into a ratio to get them to talk about areas in which the North Korean regime has high stability or low stability, You could do the calculation. If you're talking about high stability, and that means low instability. If they're talking about low stability, they're talking about high instability. That, I think, is a way to get the vocabulary to politically desensitize this type of discussion, where we need to figure out what really is going on. That's the first order of business.
Professor Yu, just one more. We do have just 4 more minutes.
Quick answer to such good questions. The first one is that Chinese, whenever we talk about the Korean issue with the Chinese intellectuals, they think it's inevitable for them, even for them to expect the unification by South Korean terms. But they worry about after the unification, they do not want to see U.S. troops next to their border. So I don't think it's their formal or official condition for accept the unification by South Korea, but they feel that if we continue to maintain the U.S. troops below the 38th parallel, then I think the Chinese would cooperate in case there was a time for unification. The second one is the puppet regime. North Korea propagandized against South Korea that South Korea is just a puppet. But whenever we had a agreement with North Korea accepted that South Korea is the real counterpart to consider the peace mechanism, as they talked in 2007 summit meeting, when they mentioned that if we want to change the truth system to the permanent peace system, then they or both North and South Korea would organize 3 or 4 party dialogue. And therefore, I think the puppet is just a kind of a program for propaganda or a kind of a transitional type of description against South Korea. And the dilemma is there is certainly a security dilemma, but the dilemma for North Korea is a double dilemma. Because if North Korea maintains the nuclear power state, then the international community, including South Korea, could not lift the sanction against North Korea, and therefore North Korea's economy could be fully recovered, and therefore it's kind of a situation for them to get disappointment among their own people, and therefore they could not guarantee their own regime survival. And also, if they decide to denuclearization, and then they could open and reform, then it is time for them to worry about the security of their own regime. So it's kind of double dilemma for North Korea. The third question is about the changes on. I think totally agree with that. And over the last 20 years, at least since the collapse of former communist countries in Eastern Europe, North Korea tried to normalize relations with South Korea, and therefore there was a growing expectation for peaceful unification. But among South Koreans, well, we had a annual survey on various issues. But over the last 20 years, majority of South Korean people expect that we could achieve unification only in 20 years. There is absolutely no changes every year. So I think it's true. If in 20 years, if we couldn't achieve unification, then the majority of South Korean people still believe that we can achieve unification in 20 years. So I think it's a dilemma. And therefore, I ask our government, it is time for our government to make a kind of time table that in 5 years, after the term of the presidency, then they should reduce the gap between the expectancy of the final question is the preconditions of denuclearization. Well, the Myanmar government had difficulty to persuade not just to the North Korea but to the international community as well as our domestic people that the denuclearization is not the precondition for resolving all the issues between the two Koreas. And therefore, Park Geun-hye government already declared that denuclearization is very important because we cannot maintain peace and stability and unification once North Korea maintains its nuclear power status. But however, if North Korean authorities decide to denuclearization or they dismantle the nuclear development program, then we could continue our trustship, building trustship between the two sides. And that means that we can achieve a normalization through the small steps. That we can continue or resume humanitarian assistance, and then we can revise the May 24th measurement, which is a sanction against North Korea because North Korea sunk our naval vessels. And therefore, I think a small step is not a kind of a problem for resolving or improve the inter-Korean relations. Thank you.
And Dr. Kim, we're 1 minute over, so the other panel may invade the room very soon.
We answered all the questions.
Great, so first thank you to all participants in this panel, and also
Just for a year.
Thank you for really
the current serving government officials being able to ask interesting questions and reveal much more in the way they frame the questions than the answers they give. And then the third, track two, usually academics and others who address similar types of questions, but with publicly available information where the dependence is on what looks rational, what doesn't. It tends to be a little more theoretical type of discussion. The policy recommendations reveal that a lot. And with respect directly to that question, how useful are the Chinese commentators? In the track two, I would say not much, because the reality of the situation on the ground is that majority of Chinese academics are gaming their comments to get that MacArthur or that Ford Foundation grant. They're saying some very interesting things, but they are very far removed from what you mentioned, the very discrete channels that exist between the Communist Party of China International Liaison Department and their North Korean counterparts. So even the Chinese Foreign Ministry is cut out in terms of what's going on. So with this, I think there's a necessity for something like a policy R&D mechanism. It's still a work in progress, but if you're able to harvest some of these very difficult questions and send very discrete messages and use that as a basis of more specific track 1.5 dialogues and meetings, that is entering into a space that no one is really working. That is a capacity constrained environment, but a top priority. But when you look at your second question, very specifically, why the Chinese won't talk about collapse scenarios, it's because they have a work in progress, and that is rehabilitating the Workers' Party of Korea. And the Communist Party of China view is if you build up the Workers' Party of Korea as an institution in North Korea, you have a more durable structure there. You can potentially have the basis of economic reform. And ultimately, the realization of not an independent China-North Korea policy, an independent South Korea policy, but what the Communist Party of China calls a balanced Korean Peninsula strategy, which means that if you look at their relationship with South Korea, the Communist Party elites view that as a vibrant pillar that's just becoming more vibrant. But the relationship between the Communist Party of China and the Workers' Party of Korea is seen as a toothpick. And a very brief side note, that is a South Korean reaction to Ostpolitik and the Northern policy, something that reestablished the terms of détente on the Korean Peninsula that almost led to the collapse of the North Korean regime, in the sense that South Korea, in return for trade credits to the Chinese and giving the Chinese help in getting wage gains and rehabilitation from kind of 1989, the Chinese agreed to cut off their traditional relationship with North Korea in a very delicate period. But ever since that, there's been something of a lost decade of high-level Communist Party of China Workers' Party of Korea relations. During that period, coincidence or correlation that's still debatable, North Korea cranks up the plutonium production at Yeol. They go in a direction that is very much away from the early 1990s intercurrent agreements. But the bottom line there is when you look at these collapse scenarios, the Communist Party of China has their own game plan. They are going to weather the criticisms of so-called coddling their allies, not to be a spokesperson, but to convey some of the key points that come out. But where we can have a discussion is on indicators of stability. If the Chinese are so sensitive about talking instability in North Korea, if we can convert that into a ratio to get them to talk about areas in which the North Korean regime has high stability or low stability, you could do the calculation. If you're talking about high stability, and that means low instability. If you're talking about low stability, then you're talking about high instability. That, I think, is a way to get the vocabulary to politically desensitize this type of discussion, where we need to figure out what really is going on. That's the first order of business.
Professor Yu, just one more. We do have just 4 more minutes.
Quick answer to such good questions. The first one is that Chinese, whenever we talk about the Korean issue with the Chinese intellectuals, they think it's inevitable for them, even for them, to expect the unification by South Korean terms. But they worry about after the unification, they do not want to see U.S. troops next to their border. So I don't think it's their formal or official condition for accept the unification by South Korea, but they feel that if we continue to maintain the U.S. troops below the 38th parallel, then I think the Chinese would cooperate in case there was a time for unification. And the second one is the puppet regime. North Korea propaganda against South Korea, that South Korea is just a puppet. But whenever we had a agreement with North Korea accepted that South Korea is the real counterpart to consider the peace mechanism, as they talked in 2007 summit meeting, when they mentioned that if we want to change the truth system to the permanent peace system, then they or both North and South Korea would organize 3 or 4 party dialogue. And therefore, I think the puppet is just a kind of a problem for propaganda, or a kind of a transitional type of discrimination against South Korea. And the dilemma is that there is certainly a security dilemma, but the dilemma for North Korea is a double dilemma. Because if North Korea maintains the nuclear power state, then the international community, including South Korea, could not lift the sanction against North Korea, and therefore North Korea's economy couldn't be fully recovered, and therefore this kind of situation for them to get disappointment among their own people, and therefore they could not guarantee their own regime survival. And also, if they decide to denuclearization, and then they could open and reform, then it is time for them to worry about the security of their own regime. So it's kind of double dilemma for those people. The third question is about the changes on. I think totally agree with that. And over the last 20 years, at least since the collapse of former communist countries in Eastern Europe, North Korea tried to normalize relations with South Korea, and therefore there was a growing expectation for peaceful unification. But among South Koreans, well, we had a annual survey on various issues. But over the last 20 years, majority of South Korean people expect that we could achieve unification only in 20 years. There is absolutely no changes. Every year, So I think it's true. If in 20 years, if we couldn't achieve unification, then the majority of South Korean people still believe that we can achieve unification in 20 years later. So I think it's a dilemma. And therefore, I ask our government, it is time for our government to make a kind of time table that in 5 years after the term of the presidency, then they should reduce the gap between the expectancy of the final question is the preconditions of denuclearization. Well, the Lee government had difficulty to persuade not just to the North Korea but to the international community as well as our domestic people that the denuclearization is not the precondition for resolving all the issues between the two Koreas. And therefore, Park Geun-hye government already declared that denuclearization is very important because we cannot maintain peace and stability and unification once North Korea maintains its nuclear power status. But however, if North Korean authorities decide to denuclearization or they dismantle the nuclear development program, then we could continue our trustship, building the trustship between the two sides. And that means that we can achieve a normalization through the small steps. That we can continue or resume humanitarian assistance, and then we can revise the May 24th measurement, which is a sanction against North Korea because North Korea sunk in our naval vessels. And therefore, I think a small step is not a kind of a problem for resolving or improve the inter-Korean relations. Thank you.
And Dr. Kim, we're 1 minute over, so the other panel may invade the reverse.
We answered all the questions.
Great. So first, thank you to all participants in this panel and also